This is the instructions for writing assignment number 2 on skepticism. Your skepticism paper is going to be due by the end of the day, Friday, on October 22nd, 2021. And the instructions are for you to write a 700 to 800 word paper on one of the skeptical arguments that was covered in lecture and or the course readings. There's 4 different options for you to choose from. And you must follow the outline that I am about to provide. If you do not follow the outline, your paper will not be accepted and you will have to rewrite it and return it back in for a late penalty. Please turn it into Canvas in a PDF or a doc format document, 12-point font, normal font type, double-spaced, and citations are only necessary if you cite something outside of the course readings or lecture material. Otherwise, no need for citations. For the outline of your paper, basically, I want you to take the argument that you're interested in, one of the arguments. You don't have to write about all 4, just one of the arguments. Take one argument, lay the argument out, that is, give it in the premise, conclusion form. Then explain each premise. That means talk about the first premise, then talk about the second premise, then talk about the third premise, and offer reasons for thinking why each premise is reasonable. So basically, when you talk about the first premise, discuss reasons that you might think that the first premise is true. Same with the second premise, right? And just explain those premises themselves, give examples that back them up if you need to, and discuss generally why or how they're reasonable in some sense. Third, then you need to explain how the premises support the conclusion. That is just how, when you take the premises all together, you get something like a modus ponens style argument or modus tollens style argument, and you end up with the conclusion following. And then finally, last part of your paper, you should, assuming that you think that the argument fails, which all of these arguments I think do, you should choose one of the premises that you think is the wrong premise, is bad, is false, is the premise that's the stinker. And then you should explain why you think that premise is false. Basically just giving reasons for thinking that the premise can't be true, or give examples why we should think that the premise is false. Just general plausibility explanations as to why the premise is implausible for some reason, anything like that. And then explain how, by denying that premise, you can avoid the conclusion of the argument. Now, most of the skeptical arguments come from the Feldman chapter on skepticism. The first one you can choose from is the possibility of error argument. Here I have it numbered in the way that Feldman has it numbered. So for almost any belief any person has about the external world, that belief could be mistaken. If a belief could be mistaken, then it's not a case of knowledge. Therefore, almost any belief any person has about the external world is not a case of knowledge. In other words, no one knows anything or more than very little about the external world. And this follows from these first 2 premises. Again, if you were to choose this argument because you thought that it was, interesting and then ultimately false, you would need to deny premise 2 or premise 1 here. One of those 2 premises, these 2 premises together, the conclusion follows, and you need to deny one of these 2 premises. So you have to come up with a reason for thinking one of these 2 premises is false. Here's the second argument, the certainty argument. If S, some subject, knows that P, then S is absolutely certain of P. That's premise 1. Premise 2, no one is ever absolutely certain of anything about the external world. So, conclusion, no one knows anything about the external world, where it follows from premises 1 and 2. So again, here, if you choose the certainty argument, because you think that this doesn't work as an argument, you need to pick one of the 2 premises, premise 1 or premise 2, and say why it's wrong, after explaining the argument, of course. For, more information on how to explain these arguments, or how to deny the premises, go back to the lecture where I discuss these arguments, or do a more close reading of the arguments given in the chapter by Feldman. Here we have the transmissibility argument, probably the most interesting and complicated of the arguments, but still also probably the most fun. In this argument, we have O and SK which are basically just stand-ins for different kinds of propositions. So O here is just any ordinary statement about the world. You can change this if you want, but I chose the statement I have hands. And SK is any skeptical hypothesis about the world. And so the skeptical hypothesis in this situation is that I am being deceived by intelligent robots keeping my brain trapped in the matrix. Now, the way the argument goes, we have premise 1. S, some knower, right, cannot know that SK is false. So take me, for instance. I cannot know that I am not being deceived by intelligent robots keeping my brain trapped in the matrix, right? I can't know that SK here is false. Premise 2. O, the ordinary statement that I have hands, implies that SK is false, right? If I have hands, then I'm not being deceived by an intelligent robots keeping my brain trapped in the matrix. This is also sort of assuming that, I'm not a body with hands trapped in the matrix. I'm just a brain. So O implies that SK is false, and S knows this, right? So if S is me, then I know it, right? I know that if I have hands, then I'm not a brain in the matrix. Premise 3, if S knows that O is true, and that O implies that SK is false, then S can know that SK is false. So if I know that it's true that I have hands, and that if I have hands, then SK must be false, then I'm not brain trapped in the matrix, then I can know that I'm not trapped in the matrix, that I can know that SK is false. Now, because ultimately, this is what's called a modus tollens style argument, because I can't know that SK is false given premise 1, then we do a modus tollens on this, and that ultimately gets us back to the fact that S does not know O. Ultimately, I do not know that I have hands. And that's the skeptical argument, the transmissibility argument. Finally, another complicated argument, but one that's worth discussing, is the future-like-past argument, the FLP argument. In this one, we have premise 1. If your belief in the future-like-past principle is justified, then it's either justified by direct observation or by inductive reasoning. Premise 2. Your belief in the future-like-past principle isn't justified by direct observation. There were reasons that were given for this in lecture and in the reading. Premise 3, your belief in the future-like-past principle isn't justified by inductive reasoning. There are reasons given for this in the reading, particular and in lecture, discussing circularity. Premise 4, so your belief in the future-like-past principle is unjustified. 5, if your belief in the future-like-past principle is unjustified, then you don't know anything about the future. Therefore, conclusion, so you don't know anything about the future. If you want to choose this argument, then you need to deny either premise 1, 2, 3, or 5. Premise 4 here is a sub-conclusion, and so it's not something that you can really deny without denying either 1, 2, or 3. So you need to pick one of these and try and stand by it. Generally, the two most interesting ones to try and argue with are 2 and 3. You can try and say something about how the future-like-past principle is justified by direct observation, or how it is justified by inductive reasoning, or you could say something about how premise 1 is wrong because it gives a false dilemma. Finally, a note about feedback. Please, if you want feedback on your papers, write that you want feedback on your papers right at the top near your name, because it takes me a while to give good comments and help people out, and if you're not going to ultimately read those comments, then it's a waste of my time and a waste of your time. Good luck with your papers, and I sure hope that you don't, fail to know anything about skepticism by the end of this.